The autumn wind in the Pacific Northwest had a way of cutting through a coat, no matter how thick it was. At 22 years old, Zola had learned to dress in layers. But she hadn't yet learned how to completely numb herself against the chill of the evening shift. She stepped out of the side door of the community center, the heavy metal door clanking shut behind her, and locked it with a practiced twist of her key. The sound echoed in the empty parking lot, signaling that her workday was finally done. Zola let out a long breath that turned into a white cloud in the frigid air. She was tired. It was a deep kind of tired that settled in her bones, the kind that came from being on her feet for 6 hours straight and managing the chaotic energy of after-school programs. But as she turned toward the street, a familiar, rhythmic tapping sound made the fatigue melt away, just a little. Waiting for her on the curb was Duke. He was a massive German shepherd, mostly dark fur with tan eyebrows that gave him a perpetually serious look. He sat with perfect posture, his tail thumping a steady beat against the concrete when he saw her. He wasn't on a leash. He never needed one. To anyone else passing by, Duke looked like a formidable, perhaps even scary, guard dog. He was scarred across his nose and had a build that suggested pure power. But to Zola, he was just a big baby who was afraid of thunder and loved sweet potatoes. Duke, Zola said softly, her voice raspy from hours of talking. You ready to go home? Duke stood up, stretched his front legs out in a long, lazy bow, and trotted over to her. He immediately nudged his head against her thigh, demanding a scratch behind the ears. Zola smiled, a small, genuine thing that reached her eyes. She obliged him, running her fingers through his thick coat. The streetlights flickered on as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was that time of evening where the world turns gray and shadows get long. Zola pulled her beanie down lower. It was a source of constant conversation and sometimes scrutiny, but for Zola, it was just practical. She kept her hair cut very short, close to her scalp. She didn't have curls or an afro. She just had her own hair, neat and low maintenance. She remembered the conversation she had with her aunt just last week. Her aunt had told her she should grow it out, let it get some length, look more feminine. People often had opinions about black women's hair, as if they were entitled to an opinion on her body. Zola usually just shrugged it off. She liked the way she looked. She liked the sharp lines of her jawline without hair to hide them. It made her feel clean, defined. It was her choice, and that was what mattered. Still, walking alone at night with short hair made her feel exposed in a way she couldn't always explain. It made her feel visible. Come on, buddy, Zola said, starting the walk toward her apartment, which was about a mile away. It wasn't a far walk, but this particular stretch of road was isolated. Old warehouses and closed-down shops lined the street. There were no open businesses, no people walking, and the streetlights were spaced too far apart. Duke fell into step beside her, not pulling, not wandering. He walked right at her heel, his shoulder occasionally brushing against her leg. It was a grounding presence. He was warm and solid, a living anchor in the creeping darkness. As they walked, Zola thought about Duke's history. It was a strange irony that such a gentle dog had such an intense past. He hadn't started out as a family pet. He had actually been born and raised to be a police dog. He had gone through the rigorous training, learning how to track, how to bite, how to attack on command. But somewhere along the line, the trainers determined he wasn't cut out for the force. The police report she had seen when she adopted him simply said, "Lacks necessary aggression." The trainer at the shelter had laughed about it. "He's too nice," the man had said. "He wouldn't bite a criminal if the guy was handing out treats. He loves people too much." Zola had found that hard to believe looking at his strong frame and sharp teeth. But over the last year, she had seen the truth of it. Duke loved everyone. He liked the mailman. He liked the neighbors. He even liked the squirrels, though he certainly liked chasing them more than being friends with them. He was a retired police dog who had failed his final exam because he was too friendly. That failure was Zola's gain. The wind picked up, rattling a loose piece of metal on a nearby roof. Zola zipped her jacket up all the way to her chin. She kept her eyes on the pavement, counting her steps to keep her mind occupied. 1, 2, 3, 4. The rhythmic crunch of her boots on the gravel was soothing. Up ahead, a car turned onto the street. It was an older pickup truck, dark blue or maybe black in this light. It was moving slowly. Too slowly. Zola watched it out of the corner of her eye. Her heart rate kicked up a notch, a natural survival instinct. She tightened her grip on the strap of her bag, though she knew the only real weapon she had was walking beside her. Duke noticed it too. He stopped wagging his tail. His ears perked up, swiveling toward the sound of the engine. He let out a low, rumbling sound in his chest. Not a growl, exactly, but a notice that something wasn't right. He stepped closer to Zola, pressing his side firmly against her leg. "It's okay, Duke," Zola whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to convince him or herself. "Just keep walking." They moved to the side of the sidewalk, hugging the fence line to give the car plenty of room to pass. The engine hummed, a low, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate in Zola's chest. As the truck approached, the headlights cut through the gloom, blinding her for a moment. She looked down, shielding her eyes. The truck didn't speed past. It slowed down until it was rolling at a walking pace, matching her stride. The window on the driver's side was rolled down. Music was thumping inside, heavy bass that shook the truck's frame. Zola kept her head down. She didn't make eye contact. That was the rule, wasn't it? Don't engage. Just keep walking. She felt a bead of cold sweat trickle down her back despite the freezing temperature. She could feel eyes on her, scanning her. She knew what they saw: a young black woman alone at night, the dog that looked scary but was currently just sniffing at a patch of weeds. The truck inched closer. The passenger side window rolled down with a mechanical whir. A voice called out. It was loud, slurred slightly, and carried a heavy weight of hostility. "Hey, girl." Zola ignored it. She stared at Duke's pause, counting his steps instead of her own. "You deaf?" The voice shouted again. This time, there was laughter from inside the cab. "We're talking to you." Duke stopped walking. He planted his 4 feet firmly on the ground and looked at the truck. He let out a sharp bark, short and loud. "Whoa," the driver said, sounding surprised. "Nice dog, lady?" He, a police dog. Zola didn't answer. She tugged gently on Duke's collar. "Come on, Duke. Let's go." She tried to guide him around the front of the truck to get past them and put some distance between herself and the vehicle. But the truck crept forward, cutting off her path. The engine idled roughly, puffing out gray exhaust that smelled of gasoline and neglect. 2 men were in the cab. The driver was a heavy-set man with a beard, leaning over the steering wheel to look at her. The passenger was younger, thinner, with a cap pulled low over his eyes. They were both white, and the look on their faces wasn't friendly. It was the kind of look that Zola had seen before, the kind that tightened her stomach and made her hands shake. "We just want to ask you something," the passenger said. He leaned halfway out the window, his eyes darting from Zola's face to Duke. "Why are you dressed like a man?" Zola froze. She knew it was coming. Comments about her hair, her clothes, her appearance. It was a familiar script. "Where's your hair?" The driver chimed in, laughing harshly. "You trying to be a dude or something?" Zola felt a flush of anger rise in her chest, hot and fast. She wanted to scream at them. She wanted to tell them it was none of their business. But fear held her tongue. She looked at the road ahead. There was still half a mile to go before she reached the main intersection, where there were lights and people. "Leave me alone," Zola said. Her voice didn't sound as strong as she wanted it to. It sounded small. The passenger sneered. "Or what? You're gonna sick your dog on us?" Duke stepped forward. He didn't look like a pet anymore. His lips curled back slightly, revealing white teeth. He stopped his friendly panting and stared at the men with intense focus. The driver laughed, but it sounded nervous now. "Get back, mutt," he yelled, revving the engine. Zola tugged Duke's collar harder, pulling him back toward the fence. She needed to get away. She needed to run, but her feet felt like they were stuck in cement. The truck idled there, blocking her path, the 2 men leering at her, the hate rolling off them in waves. The quiet evening had shattered, replaced by the thumping of the bass and the pounding of her own heart. She was alone, outnumbered, and the street was darker now than it had been a minute ago. The silence of the street was completely gone, replaced by the heavy thrumming of the truck's engine. It vibrated right through the soles of Zola's boots, rattling her teeth. The truck wasn't just idling anymore. The driver had his foot on the brake, but the vehicle was inching forward. Crawling over the asphalt like a predator stalking its prey, Zola tried to step back, to put more distance between herself and the headlights. But her heel hit the curb. There was nowhere else to go. The chain-link fence of the old warehouse was pressed tight against her back. "Said, leave me alone," Zola repeated. This time, she tried to make her voice harder, sharper. She wasn't just a young woman walking home now. She was cornered. She squeezed Duke's collar tighter, knuckles turning white. The two men exchanged a look that made Zola's blood run cold. It was a look of entitlement, a look that said they knew they were in control and they were enjoying it. The driver killed the engine, but the headlights stayed on, blinding Zola. The sudden quiet was somehow worse than the noise. The passenger door creaked open. "Don't be like that," the passenger said. He swung his legs out and stood up. He was taller than he looked, sitting down, lanky and unsteady. He wore a dirty jacket and boots that thudded heavily on the pavement. "We're just having a conversation. Aren't we, boys?" The driver's side door opened too. The heavy man stepped out, slamming the door shut with a sound that echoed like a gunshot. He walked around the front of the truck, the light from the headlights casting long, twisted shadows behind him. Zola's heart was hammering against her ribs so hard it hurt. She looked down the street, hoping, praying to see another pair of headlights, a taxi, a jogger, anyone. But the road was empty. It was just her, Duke, and the two men closing the distance. "You look tough," the driver said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He took a step closer, invading the space that Zola desperately needed to feel safe. "Short hair? Walking around with a big dog? You think you're a man? You think you can handle yourself out here?" Duke wasn't growling anymore. He had gone perfectly still. That was the thing about Duke. When he was playful, he was noisy. He barked at squirrels. He snored when he slept. He whined when he wanted dinner. But when he was serious, he was silent. He stood right in front of Zola, his body rigid, blocking the men from reaching her. His ears were pinned back flat against his head, and his gaze was locked on the driver. "Get back," Zola warned them. She didn't have a weapon, but she hoped she sounded like she did. "My dog will bite. He's not friendly," the passenger laughed. It was a high-pitched, ugly sound. "That dog? That thing looks like a marshmallow. Look at him." He reached into his pocket, and Zola flinched, expecting a knife or a gun. But he pulled out a metal lighter, flicking it on and off. The flame danced in the dark, casting a small, eerie glow on his face. "Hey, Pooch!" the passenger taunted, clicking the lighter. "Want a treat?" He laughed at his own joke. The driver ignored his friend. His eyes were fixed on Zola's face, specifically on her short hair. He seemed offended by it. It was a hatred that didn't make sense to Zola, a hatred for something that wasn't hurting him. But it was burning in his eyes nonetheless. "I bet you're not a real woman," the driver said, his voice dropping lower, losing the joking tone. "Real women have long hair. They look like ladies. You look like a boy trying to be tough." He took another step. He was now close enough that Zola could smell the stale beer on his breath and the faint scent of cigarette smoke. It was suffocating. "Get away from me," Zola shouted. She didn't care about being polite anymore. She didn't care about de-escalating. She just wanted them gone. She shoved her hand into her pocket, fumbling for her phone. Her fingers brushed the screen, but her hands were sweating so much she almost dropped it. The driver saw the movement. He moved with a speed that surprised her. He lunged forward, his hand shooting out not to grab her but to grab Duke. "Get that dog out of here," he yelled. Duke reacted instantly. He snapped his jaws, a sharp clacking sound, missing the man's hand by an inch. The driver jumped back, cursing. "Stupid animal!" The driver spat. He rubbed his hand, checking for a bite that hadn't landed. His face twisted in anger. The drunken amusement was gone. Now, it was just rage. Zola saw the shift. It was like watching a switch flip. These men weren't just trying to scare her anymore. They were angry that she had defenses. They were angry that she wasn't an easy target. The passenger stepped up beside his friend. "Let's just mess with the dog," he said, flicking his lighter again. "Teach it a lesson." "No," Zola screamed. "Don't touch him." Duke sensed the danger spiking. He let out a low rumble, a sound that started deep in his belly and vibrated against Zola's leg. It was a warning. Asterisk, back off. Or else, asterisk, the driver wasn't listening. He looked at Duke with pure malice. "I hate dogs like this," he muttered. "They think they own the place." The man lunged again. This time, he didn't go for the dog. He reached past Duke's snapping teeth and grabbed Zola by the arm. His grip was iron hard, his fingers digging into her jacket sleeve. "Come here," he grunted, pulling her forward. Zola stumbled, losing her balance. She was yanked away from the fence, the only safety she had. The pain in her arm was sharp, immediate. She cried out, a sound of pure fear. Duke went wild. He barked, a booming, ferocious sound that Zola had never heard come out of him before. He threw himself at the man, but the driver kicked out. Catching Duke in the shoulder, the dog yelped and stumbled back. The passenger laughed, stepping in to grab Zola's other arm. They had her now. She was trapped between them, the smell of alcohol and aggression choking her. "Let go of me," Zola thrashed, kicking her legs out, trying to connect with a shin, a knee, anything. But they were stronger than her. They were bigger. "Look at her, fighting like a man," the driver sneered in her ear. His breath was hot and disgusting. "Maybe we need to cut that hair shorter. Teach you a lesson." Zola's stomach dropped. The words hung in the cold air, terrifying and real. She looked at the passenger. He wasn't laughing anymore. His hand was going to his pocket again, but this time it wasn't a lighter. He pulled out a folding knife. It was small, but the blade glinted under the streetlights. "Just scare her," the driver muttered. "Just scare her." But Zola saw the look in the passenger's eyes. He was high on the power, the fear, the hate. He wasn't just going to scare her. She was trapped. Duke was trying to get to her, but the driver was keeping him back with kicks and shoves. The dog was barking so loudly it was hurting Zola's ears, a desperate pleading sound. He was trying to tell her he was there. But he couldn't get through the wall of men. The passenger flicked the knife open, the click, sound final and absolute. He pressed the flat of the cold metal blade against Zola's cheek, right near her ear. "Nice and smooth," he whispered. "Let's see if we can make it smoother." Tears blurred Zola's vision. She squeezed her eyes shut. This was it. She was going to get hurt. She was going to get cut. She prayed for it to be over fast. She thought about her mother, her apartment, the safe feeling of her own bed. It all felt so far away. The world narrowed down to the cold metal on her face, the stinking grip of the driver, and the frantic barking of the dog she loved. She waited for the pain to start. Then everything changed. There was a roar, not from a human throat, but from deep inside the animal chest of a German shepherd who had finally had enough. Duke stopped retreating. He stopped barking for help. He decided to help himself. Zola felt the grip on her arm loosen as the driver turned, distracted by the sudden, terrifying change in the dog's demeanor. She opened her eyes just in time to see Duke launch himself into the air. He was a blur of dark fur and teeth, propelled by a force that had been dormant until this exact, desperate second. The failed police dog was gone. The protector had arrived. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. The cold metal of the knife blade was still pressing against Zola's cheek, a terrifying promise of pain. The driver's grip on her arm was iron-tight, his fingers digging into her muscle-like talons. But then, the air shifted. It wasn't a sound that broke the moment first. It was a blur of motion. Duke didn't bark a warning. He didn't growl to give them a chance to back down. He simply launched himself. It was pure, explosive energy. 90 pounds of muscle and fur flew through the cold night air, colliding with the driver like a living cannonball. The impact was sickeningly loud. Heavy thud. That knocked the wind out of the man instantly. The driver's eyes went wide with shock. He hadn't expected it. He had seen a friendly, goofy pet in a parking lot, not a calculated predator. His grip on Zola's arm broke as he was ripped backward. Stumbling under the immense weight of the dog, Zola fell to her knees, scraping her skin on the rough pavement, but she didn't care about the pain. She scrambled backward, crab-walking away from the chaos as fast as she could. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst out of her chest. No. "Duke!" the passenger screamed. He fumbled with his knife, trying to figure out whether to go after Zola or help his friend. Duke didn't give them time to think. He was a whirlwind of focused aggression. He had the driver pinned against the side of the truck, barking ferociously. It wasn't the happy barking he did when he saw a squirrel. It was a deep, chest-straddling roar that vibrated in Zola's bones. The dog's lips were curled back, exposing long white teeth that looked like daggers in the harsh headlights. "Get him off! Get him off me!" the driver shrieked. He was trying to cover his face, terror stripping away his earlier toughness. He kicked his legs out, flailing wildly, but Duke was too fast. He dodged the kicks and snapped his jaws inches from the man's throat. It was a warning shot, clear as day. Asterisk, move again. I will tear it out. Asterisk. Zola stared at the scene, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. This was the dog who slept on her feet. This was the dog who was afraid of the vacuum cleaner. Seeing him like this, seeing the raw power he had been hiding, was shocking. It was like watching a superhero take off a disguise. The passenger regained his balance. Panic was written all over his face now. He wasn't enjoying the power trip anymore. He raised the knife, his hand shaking violently. He stepped toward Duke, swinging the blade wildly to stab the dog. "Duke, look out!" Zola screamed, her voice cracking. Duke heard her. Without looking away from the driver, he shifted his weight. When the passenger lunged, Duke spun with impossible speed. He didn't bite the man's arm. He clamped his jaws around the passenger's heavy jacket sleeve and shook his head violently. The momentum sent the younger man spinning, crashing into the metal door of the truck with a hollow clang. The knife skittered across the pavement, sliding away under the car and out of reach. Both men were now disarmed and terrified. The driver was still curled up against the truck, shielding his head, whimpering for mercy. The passenger was clutching his jacket, staring at Duke with wide, unbelieving eyes. Duke stood in the center of the chaos, panting heavily. Steam rose from his body in the cold air. He looked like a wolf. He looked dangerous. He looked magnificent. The driver tried to crawl toward the open door of the truck, thinking he could escape to the safety of the cab. Duke wasn't having it. He lunged forward, barking a sharp staccato bark that sounded like a gunshot. The man froze, pressing himself flat against the icy asphalt. "Stay," Zola commanded. She didn't know where the word came from, but it came out loud and strong. Duke listened instantly. He stopped his advance. He stood his ground, legs braced, head low, eyes locked on the two men. He was a wall of fur and teeth that they could not pass. The passenger looked from the dog to Zola, who was now standing a few feet away. She wasn't cowering anymore. The adrenaline had kicked in, replacing her fear with a fierce, protective rage. These men had come into her life, threatened her, and tried to hurt her best friend. She looked at them with disgust. "Get in your truck," Zola said. Her voice didn't shake. "Get in and leave." "It's a monster," the passenger stammered, looking at Duke. "He's a good dog," Zola spat back, "and you almost found out exactly how good he is. Now get out of here before I let him finish what he started." She didn't actually know if Duke would bite them. She hoped he wouldn't. She knew that once he bit them, everything would get complicated. Police reports, quarantine, lawsuits. But she didn't let that fear show. She stood tall, projecting a confidence she didn't feel. She kept her hand near Duke's collar, letting the men know she was the one holding the leash, even though there was no leash. The driver, still on the ground, scrambled awkwardly to his knees. He kept his eyes on Duke the entire time, terrified to make a wrong move. He fumbled for the door handle, pulling himself up into the cab. "Just go, man, just go," the passenger shouted, practically climbing over the hood to get to the passenger side door. Duke growled as they moved. a low rumble in his throat that vibrated against Zola's hand. He stalked forward a step, herding them away from her. The passenger yanked his door open and threw himself inside. The engine was still running, thankfully. The driver slammed his foot onto the gas pedal before the doors were even fully closed. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning on the gravel, screeching as they fought for traction. For a second, it looked like the truck was going to swerve toward them. Maybe a last act of spite, but Duke snapped his jaws and let out a terrifying bark that made the driver flinch. The truck corrected its course and sped down the dark road. Red taillights flashed in the distance, reflecting off the wet pavement, and then disappeared around the corner. Silence rushed back into the street. It was heavy and ringing in Zola's ears. The engine sound was gone. The shouting was gone. The only sound was her own ragged breathing and Duke's heavy panting. Zola stood there for a moment, her legs trembling so badly she thought they might give out. The reality of what just happened crashed down on her all at once. She looked at Duke. He was still standing in a protective stance, facing the direction the truck had gone. His fur was standing up along his spine, and his muscles were tense, ready to spring if the enemy returned. He looked wild. He looked like a stranger. "Duke," Zola whispered. At the sound of her voice, the spell broke. Duke's ears twitched. He turned his head slowly to look at her. The wild, fierce look in his eyes softened instantly. He dropped his tail, which had been rigid and straight, and gave it a small, tentative wag. He trotted over to her, the big, scary police dog gone, replaced by her loving companion. He nudged her hand with his wet nose, whining softly. He checked her over, sniffing her arms, her jacket, making sure she wasn't bleeding. He licked her hand, his tongue warm and rough against her cold skin. Zola sank to the ground. Right there on the dirty sidewalk, and wrapped her arms around his massive neck. She buried her face in his fur, letting the tears come. She cried from the fear, from the relief, and from the sheer, overwhelming gratitude for this animal. "It's okay, buddy," she sobbed, holding him tight. "It's okay. You did it. You saved me." Duke leaned into her, pressing his side against her chest, grounding her. He let out a long sigh and rested his heavy head on her shoulder. The scarred, retired dog who had failed his training because he was too friendly had just faced down 2 men with a knife. He hadn't failed anything tonight. He had done exactly what he was born to do: protect his pack. Zola pulled back to look at him. His dark eyes were watching her, filled with a deep, gentle understanding. He knew she was scared. He knew she was hurt, though her wounds were only bruises and scrapes. He leaned in and licked a tear off her cheek. "I'm so sorry I called you a marshmallow," Zola laughed through her tears. It was a weak, shaky laugh, but it was real. Duke huffed, blowing air out of his nose, as if he was laughing too. He looked back at the empty street once more, making sure the danger was truly gone, and looked back at Zola, nudging her to stand up. It was getting colder, and he wanted to go home. As Zola stood up, wiping her face with her sleeve, she looked at the empty road. The fear was still there, lingering like a bad taste in her mouth, but it was smaller now. It didn't own her, because standing next to her was the bravest soul she had ever known. They walked home together, Zola keeping one hand firmly on Duke's back, the two of them moving as one unit through the dark. Zola didn't run. She couldn't. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, filled with a strange, shaky numbness that often comes after a massive dose of adrenaline. Instead, she walked very quickly, her boots scuffing against the sidewalk in a rhythm that matched her pounding heart. Duke stayed right by her side, his shoulder pressed firmly against her leg. He wasn't pulling on the leash, and he wasn't wandering off to sniff at bushes or fire hydrants. He was on a mission. The silence of the street felt different now. 10 minutes ago, the quiet had felt peaceful. Now, it felt heavy. It felt like the air was holding its breath, waiting to see if the truck would come back. Every time a car turned onto a street a few blocks away, Zola would flinch, her breath catching in her throat. She would scan the headlights, terrified to see the dark shape of that pickup truck returning. But Duke never flinched. He kept his head up, his ears swiveling like radar dishes, tracking every sound. If a car came too close, A low rumble would start in his chest, a warning that he was still ready. He was her shield, walking between her and the rest of the world. When they finally turned the corner onto their own street, Zola felt a wave of wash over her. It wasn't total safety. She knew she wouldn't feel truly safe for a long time, but it was familiar territory. The old oak trees, the flickering street lamp in front of the neighbor's house, the red brick of her apartment building. It looked like home. They climbed the stairs to the second floor. Zola's hands were trembling so badly that she dropped her keys twice before she could fit them into the lock. Duke waited patiently, watching her back, scanning the hallway of the apartment building. Finally, the lock clicked. The door swung open, and they tumbled inside. Zola slammed the deadbolt shut, then leaned her back against the cool wood of the door and slid down to the floor. Duke immediately came over. He nudged her, pushing his wet nose under her arm, forcing her to pay attention to him. He smelled like cold night air and wet fur. He looked at her with those dark, intelligent eyes, letting out a soft whine. He seemed to be asking asterisk, "Are we okay now? Are you okay?" Asterisk, "I'm okay, Duke," Zola whispered, though her voice cracked. "We're okay." She wrapped her arms around his neck again and buried her face in his fur. For a long time, they just stayed there on the floor in the entryway. Zola let herself cry, letting out the fear and the anger that she had been holding back. Duke let her hold him. Usually, he was the one who didn't like being hugged for too long. He was an independent dog who liked his space, but tonight, he didn't move a muscle. He let her soak his coat with tears. After a few minutes, Zola took a deep, shuddering breath and pulled away. She stood up slowly, her knees aching from the cold and the impact of falling on the pavement earlier. She looked down at herself. Her jacket was dirty, her jeans were ripped at the knee, and her arm was starting to bruise where the man had grabbed her. She looked at Duke, running her hands over his body to check for injuries. She felt his ribs, his legs, his paws. "Did they kick you, buddy?" she asked softly. She found a tender spot on his shoulder where the driver had kicked him. Duke flinched slightly but didn't pull away. It didn't look broken, just bruised. "I'm going to call the police," Zola said aloud. She needed to hear her own voice say it to make it real. She walked into the kitchen and grabbed the phone. Her hands were still shaking as she dialed 911. While the phone rang, she looked out the window. The street was empty. 911, what is your emergency?" A calm voice answered. Zola explained what happened. She tried to keep her voice steady, but she could hear the panic creeping in. "They had a knife. They cornered me. They tried to cut my hair." Saying it out loud made it feel even more terrifying. She described the truck in, old blue pickup hand, the men as best as she could remember. She told them about Duke. "The dispatcher wants to know if the dog is secure," the operator asked. "Yes," Zola said, looking at Duke, who was sitting calmly by her feet. "He's my dog. He saved my life." "He's not dangerous unless you try to hurt me," operator said. An officer would be there soon. Zola hung up and sat on her sofa. Duke jumped up beside her. Usually this wasn't allowed, but tonight Zola didn't care. She needed him close. It took about 15 minutes for the patrol car to arrive. Zola saw the flashing blue and red lights dancing against her living room wall. She heard the heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. Duke stood up immediately. He moved toward the door, his body tense again. A low growl started in his throat. "It's okay, Duke," Zola said, touching his head gently. "They are here to help." She wasn't sure he understood, but he stopped growling. He stood between her and the door, watching intently. Zola opened the door. There were two officers, a man and a woman. They looked professional and calm, their hands resting near their belts, but not on their weapons. Zola instantly felt a little smaller in their presence, a natural reaction to authority, but she stood her ground. "Miss Zola?" the female officer asked. Zola nodded. "We received a call about an assault," the officer said. She looked past Zola and saw Duke. The officer paused, her eyes widening slightly. She looked at the dog's posture, the scars on his face, and the way he was guarding Zola. Is that Duke?" The officer asked. Zola was surprised. "You know him?" The officer smiled. a genuine warm smile. I recognize him from the K-9 unit. I trained his handler. His name was Duke back then, too. We were all sad when he washed out. He was too sweet for police work. Zola let out a short, dry laugh. He wasn't too sweet tonight. He protected me. The officer looked at Duke with new respect. "Good boy, Duke," she said softly. The officers came in and took a statement. Zola told them everything. She told them about the walk, the truck, the hateful words about her hair, the knife, and the assault. As she spoke, she reached down and stroked Duke's head. It gave her the courage to say the words out loud. When she got to the part where Duke attacked the men, the male officer spoke up. "Did he bite them?" "No," Zola said. "He knocked them down. He pinned them. He scared them, but he didn't bite. He stopped them from hurting me." The officers exchanged a look. "That's incredible," the female officer said. "That shows incredible discipline. Most dogs, even trained police dogs, would have bitten in that situation." He knew exactly how much force to use. The officers took pictures of Zola's bruised arm and her torn jeans. They dusted the doorknob for fingerprints, though they didn't expect to find much useful. It was dark, and the men were probably wearing gloves. They promised to patrol the area more frequently and let her know if they found the truck before they left. The female officer knelt down in front of Duke. She held out her hand for him to sniff. Duke sniffed it politely, then looked at Zola as if asking for permission. Zola nodded. Duke leaned forward and licked the officer's hand. "You are a very good boy," the officer whispered, scratching him behind the ears. "You might have failed the academy, but you passed the real test tonight." After they left, the apartment was quiet again. The adrenaline that had kept Zola going was fading fast, leaving her feeling exhausted and hollow. She locked the door again, checking the lock twice. She walked into the bathroom and turned on the light. She looked at herself in the mirror. She looked messy. Her eyes were red and puffy from crying. She touched her short hair, smoothing it down. She remembered the men's words. "Asterisk, you look like a man. We should cut your hair." Asterisk for a second. She felt a flash of shame. She wondered if she should just wear a wig tomorrow, or maybe grow her hair out. Maybe if she looked more like what they expected a woman to look like, she wouldn't be a target. But then she looked down at Duke. He was sitting in the bathroom doorway watching her. He didn't care about her hair. He didn't care if she was tall or short, feminine or masculine. He just cared that she was his person. Zola looked back at her reflection and lifted her chin. She liked her hair. It was her. It was strong. It was practical. And she was alive because she was strong too. She turned off the light and walked to the bedroom. Duke followed her, his nails clicking softly on the floor. They curled up in bed together. Zola pulled the blankets up to her chin. Duke lay right next to her, his back pressed against hers, radiating heat like a furnace. She knew she would have nightmares tonight. She knew she would be scared to walk down that street for a long time. But as she closed her eyes, listening to Duke's steady breathing, she knew she would be okay. She wasn't alone. She had a guardian. He was big, he was brave, and he was sleeping right next to her. The days that followed were not like the movies. There was no slow-motion montage where the sun shone brighter and the world suddenly made sense. Instead, the week was gray, quiet, and filled with small tremors of anxiety. Waking up was hard. Getting out of bed felt heavy. Every time Zola heard a car engine backfire or a loud exhaust pipe rumble down the street, her body would seize up. Her heart would race, and for a split second, she was back on that cold pavement, the smell of gasoline and alcohol choking her. But Duke was there. Through every panic attack, every shaky breath, Duke was her anchor. He didn't ask her to be okay. He just let her be. If she sat on the couch staring at the wall for an hour, he sat at her feet, resting his chin on her knee. If she cried, he offered her his shoulder to wipe her nose on. He was patient. He was steady. A week later, the police called with good news. They had found the truck. An alert patrol officer had spotted a dark blue pickup with a dent in the passenger side door, the exact dent Duke had caused when he slammed the man into it. They had arrested the driver and the passenger. were found with a knife in the glove box that matched the description Zola had given. They were going to be charged with assault and a hate crime. Hearing that gave Zola a sensation she hadn't felt in days. Relief. It wasn't total peace, but the heavy knot in her chest loosened just enough for her to breathe deeply again. They were off the streets. They couldn't hurt her. 2 weeks after the attack, Zola stood in front of her bathroom mirror again. It was a Saturday morning, and the sun was actually shining for a change. She looked at herself. She had put on her favorite jeans and a comfortable sweater. She looked at her hair. It had grown out maybe a fraction of an inch, still short, still close to her scalp. For a moment, she hesitated. She thought about buying a hat or maybe a scarf just to hide, to blend in. The fear was a whisper in her ear, telling her it was safer to be invisible. She looked down at Duke, who was lying in the hallway, watching her. He thumped his tail against the floor once, a happy rhythm. He was ready to go. He didn't care if she wore a hat or not. He just wanted to walk with his pack. Zola took a deep breath, grabbed a comb, and ran it over her short hair. She didn't cover it. She left it exactly as it was. "We're going for a walk, Duke," she said. Her voice was a little stronger today. He stood up immediately, his ears perked up. It was the magic word. Walk. When they stepped outside, the air was crisp but beautiful. Zola stayed away from the warehouse district. Instead, they headed toward the busy park near the city center. It was a place where people walked their dogs, jogged, and ate lunch on the grass. A place full of life and noise. As they walked down the sidewalk, Zola felt her muscles tense up. She scanned everyone who passed them. She looked at their hands, their faces, looking for any sign of aggression. It was a hard habit to break, but as they reached the park, something shifted. They walked past an older man sitting on a bench reading a newspaper. He looked up, saw Duke, and smiled. He didn't see a monster. He saw a dog. "Beautiful animal," the man said. "Is he a shepherd?" Zola nodded, stopping. "He is. He's a retired police dog." The man raised his eyebrows, impressed. "Is that so?" "He looks like a fine fellow." He didn't stare at Zola's hair. He didn't make a rude comment about her appearance. He just saw a woman walking her dog. They kept walking. A little further on, a young woman was jogging. She stopped to catch her breath near the water fountain. Duke looked at her with his big, soulful eyes. The woman laughed and bent down to pet him. "Oh my gosh, look at this face," she cooed. Duke leaned into her touch, soaking up the affection. "He is so sweet," Zola smiled. It was a real, relaxed smile. He's the best." For the first time in weeks, Zola didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel like a target. She felt seen, but in a good way. She felt like a person who had a wonderful dog. She realized that the world wasn't entirely like those two men in the truck. The world held people like the man on the bench and the jogger people who saw good things. They found a patch of grass near a big oak tree and sat down. Zola leaned back against the trunk, and Duke settled beside her, his head resting on her lap. She looked out at the park. There were families playing, kids laughing, dogs chasing frisbees. It was peaceful. She thought about what the police officer had said that night. Duke had failed the training because he was too friendly, but he had passed the real test. As she stroked his fur, she realized something important. The academy was wrong. He wasn't too friendly to be a protector. He was friendly enough. He knew the difference between a threat and a friend. He didn't attack out of anger. He defended out of love. Those men had tried to take away her dignity. They had tried to make her feel small and wrong because of who she was and how she looked. But looking at Duke, Zola felt a surge of pride. She had survived. She hadn't changed her hair. She hadn't stopped walking her neighborhood. She was still here. "Duke," she whispered. "You know what? You're a hero." Duke sneezed and wagged his tail, thumping it against the grass. He didn't care about being a hero. He just knew that Zola was happy. That made him happy. Zola took out her phone and snapped a picture of the two of them in the park. The sun was catching Duke's coat, making him shine. She looked at the photo, just a girl with short hair and her dog. It looked simple, but to her, it looked like strength. They sat there for a long time, just watching the world go by. Every time someone walked by with a dog, Duke lifted his head to check them out, but he never left Zola's side. He was her shadow, her guardian, and her best friend. Eventually, the sun began to dip lower in the sky. It was time to head home. Zola stood up, brushing the grass off her jeans. Duke hopped up, ready to go. "All right, buddy," she said. "Let's go home." The walk back was different than the walk to the park. Zola's steps were lighter. She still checked her surroundings. She knew that part of her would always be cautious now, but the fear wasn't driving the car anymore. She looked up at the sky, turning a beautiful shade of purple and orange as the sun set. She realized that bravery wasn't about not being afraid. Bravery was being terrified and walking anyway. It was looking at the dark places of the world and deciding to shine a light on them. Duke had shown her that. He had been scared too, she knew he had, but he had stood his ground to protect her. When they reached their apartment, Zola didn't feel the need to rush inside and hide. She walked up the stairs slowly, unlocking the door with steady hands. They were safe. They were together. The nightmare was over. Inside, Duke went straight to his water bowl for a drink. Zola watched him. She knew he would be back to wanting his dinner soon. He would be back to wanting to play fetch in the living room. He was still the same goofy dog who slept on the end of her bed, but he was also so much more. She walked over and gave him a hug, burying her face in his neck. He smelled like grass and fresh air now, not fear and exhaust fumes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Duke licked her cheek, leaving a wet spot, and wagged his tail. He didn't need a medal. He didn't need a certificate. He just needed her. Zola walked over to the window and looked out at the street. It was dark now, the streetlights flickering on. It was the same world as before. There would still be mean people. There would still be dangers. But as she looked at her reflection in the glass-short hair, tired eyes, but a strong face, she knew she could handle it. Because she wasn't just Zola anymore. She was Zola and Duke, and that was a team that could handle anything. She closed the curtains, turned on the lamp, and went to get Duke's dinner. Life was moving on, one step at a time.